make argument with respect to the issues. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a motion on the table, and then if it's seconded, sometimes, actually I've made a motion before it wasn't seconded, so this might be the second time, but I'm going to do make a shot at it, and then once we have a second, if we have a second, we'll have a discussion amongst the commissioners. But I guess before we get to that, I'm a little bit ahead of myself. Are there any more questions? I think Commissioner Gray said there's more questions.
Actually, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Correa was about to ask a question, and behind his question, I do have a few. Thank you.
The question is that you had mentioned as a last point of your presentation that if this is dismissed, it will have a negative effect in the capital markets for Delmarva. What is it meant by that? By the rate will be increased, the rating will go down, Delmarva will never get a loan in life, or 1 year?
A great question.
All of it.
Yes, Commissioner Correa, and it's a great question, and I just mentioned it, and I said I just wanted to mention it. And the point is, of course you don't know for sure, but having done corporate law in the state a long time, and how this state's very stable corporate law adds, as we always like to tell people, adds so much value to corporations because of the stability, the Court of Chancery, and all that. Our only point is this what we believe to be the sort of unprecedented dismissal at this point in the case, when there's plenty of time. We have agreed to a further schedule. We'll renotice public hearings. We're not going to move the rates, things like that. A dismissal in those circumstances would not indicate to the capital markets that we have a stable and predictable process here, or could. That ultimately could make it harder to raise capital. I'm not saying this one case would do it, but we're saying what is consistent with the way this commission has functioned, and we think it would want to function, would be not to do what we would see as sort of out-of-the-box steps over here on a dismissal, things like that, because people do watch these cases. That was my real message. Does that answer your question?
One example is that in 1975, New York City defaulted on the bonds, and it was almost bankrupt. And the capital market, as you said, really gave them a big slap. But in 2 years later, the same capital market came to help New York City, took care of the money, and started loaning as much money as they want. So my input to you is that capital market in about 12 months forgets a lot of things. If your balance sheet is solid, if your income statement is solid, if your demand is solid, as Delaware is, you will get the money. I can't assure you because I'm not the capital market, but one of these days I will be.
Thank you, and we just as soon not suffer the 12 months, but we understand that point, and I didn't mean to oversell it. If I did, I apologize.
Mr. Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a very interesting decision, and I think I can empathize with a number of the parties' positions around the table. I have a few questions and then a couple of comments, and I'll conclude. First question is the application of the cost to achieve lawful?
You want to answer that? You want to answer that? Yeah. Yes, Your Honor, and I know there's I don't know how this commission balances everything it does, but if you go back to the settlement agreement that you approved in the last rate case, the last rate case. I was going to tell you when it was filed, I can't remember. But in there, the settlement was, yes, we are to defer all the synergies and the costs to achieve, and a deferred utility account, you've heard the term, it's called a regulatory asset. So you must defer those costs to achieve, and then you apply them against the synergies, and the promise and the assurance that staff and DPA will track in every case is that that net value of synergies goes to customers. So yes, it is lawful. In fact, it's part of the settlement agreement that you approved that we are required to separately defer those into accounts. Did I answer your question right?
Yes, you did, but I'd like the perspective also of the public advocate on that same question.
The settlement agreement does provide, as Mr. Goodman has explained, so yes.
Okay. What I've heard is the parties need time. I heard this from the staff side, need time to deal with changes as a new case. Is there a way to extend the time needed without requiring a new case?
Our answer would be yes, of course, we've offered that. That's a new schedule. It's not an all-new filing, and that's what we would say would be the appropriate, and we're prepared to do that and have made proposals. The parties would have to work it out, but yes.
Public advocate?
We agree with that.
And the last question I have is, how does this commission incent or penalize utilities to prevent these mistakes in the future?
Yeah, it's in the MFRs in 1.5, and you spell that out. And it says that for any changes made, there's the process you go through, and then it says down here the penalty for noncompliance and exactly what happens. For instance, if after all everything's complied with from the days to respond, the notices, then if they're not corrected within the time provided, staff may move the commission to reject the application for noncompliance, and on and on. So that's if process is followed.
Well, and that's the dismissal I talked about. Mm-hmm. If your question is about what about these corrections, what's the disincentive to make these mistakes and then just come in and say fix the schedule? The answer is it's a longer schedule. We are put off from getting to an end where actual rates go in. That costs real money. So extension of the schedule is a bad thing. We're willing to do it because we understand the mistake, but that directly costs the company money. It costs us personal and reputational capital to come in and say we made a mistake, and we're also agreeing in the interim rates not to go above $24 million. So this is not a pleasant experience, and it is, in fact, costly just to extend the schedule itself.
I understand your point, but the commission's a little bit boxed in because, on the one hand, the lack of precision or getting it right to begin with does cost time, but that costs the ratepayer ultimately, right? And or it costs your rate of your return on equity, which then hits you in the capital markets, which then costs you more for your interest. So the question is a very interesting and loaded question from my perspective, because I see the position of staff and the public advocate not wanting to deal with this last-minute 30% increase. But on the other hand, how does the commission, regardless of the process, the process is there and it happened anyway? So that's why I'm asking the question. So I appreciate your response, and I'd like a perspective from the public advocate on that.
Thank you, Commissioner Gray. I want to first address the fact that the minimum filing requirements address this in 1.5. They actually don't, because this filing, there were no additional minimum filing requirements schedules filed with it. So the only way we could have, or staff could have found this error, I'm not really sure how they could have in the time frame when the case was first filed, when the company itself didn't find it for almost 2 months. So I don't think 1.5 provides any assistance in this case. In this case, we have said that, dismissal can be completed. The company controls the filing of its case, not any of the other parties. The company ostensibly was working on this case for months before it got filed. When a case gets filed, staff and the DPA, I think, have a legitimate expectation that things are going to be correct. And while again, we have never said that this was a deliberate attempt to mislead. We reject the use of the word deception. We admit it was a mistake. But as between who should pay for that mistake, shouldn't it be the party that paid it? And so we think that in this case, and granted, this commission probably has never dismissed a case before, because it is a very unusual occurrence. As I said, I can't remember in my decades of doing this big a mistake having been made. And I'm sorry that it was, because this is throwing a monkey wrench into a lot of things. But as between who should pay for it, it should not be the party that didn't make it.
Okay, thank you very much. And,
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I have just a few comments, and I'll yield. The way I see this is everybody's on a rate case journey here, and the ratepayers are paying for us to reach the same specific destination. I'm clearly disappointed Delmarva has erred in the matter, with the consequence we're all arrived later at the ultimate destination, and it will likely cost the ratepayer more money. I'd like to find ways we can preserve the investments already made by all parties and move the matter to an effective conclusion. I favor reworking of the schedule, and I did hear that the schedule can be reworked without a new case. And I would want to stipulate that the new public notices are issued in order to communicate what the ratepayer can expect as a result of the nearly 30% increase. And I think it's important that all ratepayers are informed about the specific rates projected for all classes of customers. Mr. Chair, I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner Gray. I move that the motion to dismiss be denied, that the matter be sent to the hearing examiner, a new notice of the action be set forth by the hearing examiner so the public will be informed of the substantial increase sought by the company, that the hearing examiner submit a new time schedule which should be very considerate of the DP&A and state's position as expressed in this hearing, and I think that Delmarva should hear that particularly. The new schedule should be submitted in accordance with the schedule by the hearing examiner so that Mr. Quinnan's people can know what they have to do with what they need to do for the case. That the interim 24 million figure be set as Mr. Skaggs has represented. And that any other thing that Ms. Iori wants, it was in Part B of what you said when you first opened your opening statement. Was there anything else in there?
Part B.
You gave an A, which was dismiss, and you gave a B, which was.
B was, Part B, our alternative was to use October 18th as for the filing date for the case.
Okay, let's let the hearing examiner determine what the starting date is, and then I think that's it.
I second.
Okay, time for discussion. Anyone wants to discuss it?
Yeah, I agree that if that O&M adjustment had been correct at the start, we wouldn't be having this discussion, and we would be on the 7-month schedule. But it didn't happen, and there's a significant error. And the most important thing here is making sure that the public is aware, and it's paramount. So changing that schedule, I think, is going to make everybody sort of happy, and nobody really that unhappy, except, the ratepayers, but that's what we do, and sometimes. And, I think because it's so significant that I would agree that the October 18th is the start date. If the hearing examiner would focus on that, would be appropriate, and not to start it all over.
No.
That's my comment.
Commissioner Correa.
Suppose we go with this rescheduling and what have you. What kind of a provision or internal controls will you be putting so that such a big error, 30% error, does not occur in 2019 and 2020 and then on and on? Will you be doing that, and will you tell us very informally, not now, when you put the internal controls, that this is what you have done?
Yes, and we will be doing that. One of the best practices you heard so much about back with the merger is any Exelon utility that has an incident like this does a root cause analysis, goes back to the very beginning, and to see what happened. For instance, why did the same exact settlement of the CTAs happen in the electric case but not in the gas case? And so, yes, the root cause analysis is currently being done, and part of that is the procedures by which it will be prevented in the future. So it will be done, Your Honor.
Are there any other questions on the motion? So it's clear, there's nothing in the motion about the October 18th date. Hearing no further discussion, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion carries. Thank you very much, everyone. Yes, sir. Hold on a second.
Chairman Winslow, if you'll notice, the first bullet under this item is the proposed order number 9140, which was memorializing the commission's decision from its October 31st meeting. Unfortunately, I wasn't here to have the benefit of that, but I believe that's still an ongoing issue that needs to be resolved under this item.
Thank you very much. That's a good point. I assume that everything is in order, the parties have agreed upon this order?
We have, Your Honor. It was circulated by Mr. Geddes, and Ms. Iori made a few edits. Delmarva made a few edits. Mr. Geddes accepted them, and what is before you, and I haven't actually seen what's before you, but I absolutely trust Mr. Geddes. So it's an agreed upon order.
Do we have a motion on that order?
Move we adopt order 9140 as proposed.
Seconded.
Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion, plus thanks to Mr. Hallett for bringing it to our attention.
Thank you, Bob.
Please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed?
Yes.
Any abstentions? That motion carries. Hearing schedule. In the matter of the application of Delmarva Power and Light Company for an annual update in the gas environmental surcharge rider rate. Mr. Goodman.
Your Honor, if you could give us a moment to do a little musical chairs here, because I have a witness for you. An old friend of yours.
This is my friend.
Hey, Todd, that root cause analysis, that's not going to be paid for by our ratepayers, is it? No. Alex, I'm sorry for that.
No, that's what I said.
Money woes.
Remember how I said it's an excellent thing?
I know.
I'm just kidding. It's paid for by excellent.
No, that's all right. No.
Chairman Winslow, with your permission, I'd ask to be excused.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Michael, for coming.
Okay, we're done with that for you. And get me anything you can. Okay.
That's, Representative Kowalko, thank you for your attendance. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your patience.
No problem. Mr. Goodman, when you're ready.
Yes. Changing gears here, so it takes a little while. This is, you have seen the case before you now, which is Delmarva's environmental surcharge rider. For how long, Mr. Beck? 7 or 8 years, I believe. It's been before you. And 12 years, he corrected me. And what it is, as you'll recall, is that back in the beginning of time, before anyone in this room was born, to become a real city in the United States, you had to have a light at night. And the light was provided by the gas lamps in the cities. And Wilmington was one of the early cities to have gas lamps. And the way that gas was made was it was created by coal. And so every real city had a coal gas plant. I don't know the company that built the original one to provide the gas up to the city of Wilmington, but it eventually was purchased by Delmarva Power and Light Company. And what they used to do, and it's down by the riverfront. In fact, most of the area that's now developed with the riverfront, for instance, the Penn Cinema, it is right where it was. The brand new Department of Roads and Bridges, I think it was called, wanted what came out of that plant, which was tar. At the end of the process, you got tar, and they say, put it over here, and we come get it. And that's what we did. Well, no one knew that it kind of seeps into the ground. So many, many years later, tests were done as they were developing the riverfront area, and there was the remnants of the tar in the ground, had to be cleaned up. So that's what the environmental surcharge rate is. It is a direct, no profit, just the costs of cleaning that up. And we are very close to the end of collecting that for that site, and that is what this case is about. We have reached a very helpful settlement between the parties, staff, DPA, and Delmarva Power, which instead of having to do this through 2020, which as far as the process goes, everyone has agreed that it's best for customers to wrap it up in one, because the next few years are like in the hundreds, and why conduct an entire entire surcharge rate case. So I will, that's our settlement. We're going to present it now. We're going to do it through my witness, Len Beck, and with that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Beck, if I can. She'll need to swear.
Please raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give should be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Okay, could you state your name for the record, please, Mr. Beck?
Yes. Leonard J. Beck. I'm a senior analyst in the regulatory department of Delmarva Power and Light.
How long have you been with Delmarva?
20 years and 17 years in the regulatory affairs department.
Okay. And how many years have you been involved in the annual environmental surcharge rate file?
Approximately 7, 6 past years, and then this year, again,
Okay.
as a witness.
And have you testified before this commission before?
Yes, 5 times on this case, on this matter.
Okay, great. And if you would kindly just quickly summarize this year's filing for the commission?
Yes, it's quite a drastic turnabout from the previous subject we just talked about. We're talking about a fee of 17 cents per month for a typical gas heating customer, and that is a 1 cent decrease from the previous year.
Okay. So you already, you stole my next question. This environmental surcharge rate has been going on since 2003, and do you anticipate the charge could actually be eliminated, end in the not too distant future?
Yes, the 3 consecutive sites that Todd spoke about have been remediated, cleaned up. There were no new costs this year, which is why the rate went down a little bit. And each year when we file, the money is collected back on a 5-year amortization. And because we've had no costs for a couple years, we end up with a fair amount this year being collected, but then the next 2 years it drops off to almost zero. So we were anticipating the last filing would be in the year 2020.
Okay. And have the parties agreed to a mechanism for not having to do a filing every year through the final filing of 2020?
Yes.
Would you describe that, please?
Yes. Next year, we have about $200,000 that we would be collecting through the normal process. In the year 2019, that amount drops to $672, and the year 2020, $503. So what we presented to DPA and staff was, why not throw in that $1,100 in with next year's filing and save the cost and effort and just finish the filing next year? And parties agreed to that proposal.
Okay, now these filings, of course, the rate is based upon projections for gas sales, is it not?
Correct.
So unless you have a really good crystal ball, there would be some true up, either we'd over collect a bit or under collect a bit, am I right?
Yes.
Okay, and so what happens in the last year with that true up, whether it's a credit to customers or a small recovery?
The parties agreed that between staff and DPA and Delmarva Power, we would look at what's over under collected at the end of the period and decide how to handle that small amount at that time.
And then that would be brought before the commission for its approval?
That's correct.
Okay. Do you believe, Mr. Beck, that the settlement, as you just described, combining the years and saving the cost, is in the public interest?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and why do you believe it is in the public interest?
The advantage of consolidating the last 3 filings into one filing is going to be a matter of saving time and associated cost that would be endured by the commission, the staff, DPA, and the company. And by avoiding this unnecessary time and expense, it means a more efficient and less costly regulatory process.
So, Mr. Beck, are there any corrections that you need to make for your written testimony here before we close shop on this year's
Yes,
case?
it's not in the magnitude of $7 million. On page 3, after reviewing,
It seems to be coming up too often.
Get off the record. Whose side is he on? I don't understand. He's rubbing it in, and I just don't,
on page, in reviewing the filing after 2 months of being filed, I did notice on page 3 on the table on row 1, there was a mistake by 1 decimal point. The number listed as .0087 should read .00087, which is the MCF rate. Now, this rate was incorrect in that table, but not in the rates, not in the tariffs, so it was just a typographical issue.
Okay. She wants to dismiss the case. Do you have anything else further to add, Mr. Bennett?
No, thank you, Commissioner, for your time.
I'm sorry.
This mean also that we won't have to hear the talk about how the earliest gas lamps weren't. Every time we have this, this is not the. I wasn't here for the first gas light, but I've been here for several explanations of the first gas.
I think 12. He said.
About 2003, so whatever that is, 14.
Walsh, Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Chairman Winslow and Commissioners. I'd like to call in this matter Ms. Malika Davis. Testify.
Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do. Would you please state your name and business address for the record?
Malika Davis, and the address is 1 Silver Lake Boulevard, Kinney Building, Suite 100, Dover, Delaware, 19904.
And by whom are you employed?
The Delaware Public Service Commission.
What's your position with the commission?
I'm a public utility manager.
As part of your duties and responsibilities as a public utility analyst, you decided to serve as a case manager in this docket 171014.
Yes, I are.
Do you previously served as a case manager for similar dockets?
Yes, served as a case manager for 6 other ESR documents.
As case manager in this docket, did you participate in reviewing and finalizing the proposed settlement?
I did.
Are you familiar with the terms of the proposed settlement agreement?
Yes, I am.
Do you believe that the proposed settlement agreement is in the public interest and results in just and reasonable rates?
I do.
Could you explain why you believe the settlement is in the public interest and results in just and reasonable rates?
Yes, as previously stated, there were no litigation expenses paid by Delmarva for this environmental cost share, or ECY. I reviewed Delmarva's calculations of the estimated total amount to be collected during the 2017-2018 collection period, and concluded that Delmarva had correctly calculated its estimate. I reviewed the inventorized balance and the true-up of the under-collection from the previous ECY. And I also reviewed Delmarva's calculation of the proposed ESR rate to ensure that it was correctly performed. Because all the calculations were performed correctly and in accordance with the Commission's directive, I concluded that the proposed settlement agreement will result in just and reasonable rates. In addition, there is no reason to continue to litigate this matter, and a settlement is in the public interest because it will avoid the need and cost of staff and the public advocate to file direct testimony and perhaps for Delmarva to file rebuttal testimony, which will save the ratepayers money and will avoid additional regulatory expenses.
Thank you. Ms. Davis, do you believe the Commission should approve the settlement agreement?
Yes.
I have no further questions at this time. This witness, Ms. Davis, is available for questions from the Commissioners.
Ms. Iori,
No questions.
any questions of the parties, commissioners?
No.
A motion, please.
Excuse me, I will, if the motion to dismiss stands to stay with the file, just like to join. And then,
We'll see if a motion comes out of that.
And my witness would clearly join too, as you can tell.
We have a motion on proposed order 9143.
Hang on. I have a witness.
Andrew.
I'm very, very apologetic. I I apologize to Ms. Moucher. Ms. Moucher, how could I have forgotten you? Please proceed.
Thank you, Chair Winslow. The Division of the Public Advocate calls Andrea Moucher to the stand and asks that she be sworn.
Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Ms. Moucher, would you please state your name and business address for the record?
Yes, Andrea Moucher, 29 South State Street, Dover, Delaware, 19901.
And by whom are you employed?
The Delaware Division of the Public Advocate.
And what is your position with the Delaware DPA?
A public utilities analyst.
And what are your duties and responsibilities in that position?
Generally, I'm responsible for overall management of those dockets where the public advocate has intervened. This includes review of applications, testimonies, and discovery responses, selection of consultants where necessary, and participation in development of positions taken by the public advocate in cases.
And in connection with those duties and responsibilities, were you assigned to review Delmarva's application for a change in its gas environmental surcharge rider?
Yes, sir.
And did you review the application?
I did.
Are you familiar with the settlement agreement that Delmarva, the Commission staff, and the public advocate have executed and are submitting for the Commission's consideration?
I am.
In your opinion, does the proposed settlement result in just and reasonable rates for ratepayers?
Yes.
And is it in the public interest?
It is.
Why do you believe that the proposed settlement results in just and reasonable rates and is in the public interest?
First, some good news. Delmarva's Wilmington Coal gas site south was sold in 2016, and customers will not pay for any additional remediation costs of that site. Additionally, the company incurred no costs during this environmental cost year. Therefore, the total recovery amount of $320,280.10 is based upon Commission-approved amounts from the environmental cost years of 2013 through 2016, plus an undercollection through June 2017. And that all amounts proposed for recovery have been previously approved. The analysis requires verification of the company's calculations. Observing no errors or omissions, the proposed ESR rate of 0.00160 for CCF is correct and represents a decrease from the rate currently in effect. For a typical residential gas customer using 83 CCF of natural gas during the winter month will see a 1 penny decrease on their overall bill. For these reasons, I believe the settlement is in the public interest, and the proposed ESR rate is just and reasonable, and recommend its approval by the Commission.
Are there any other issues you wish to raise relating to this matter?
Yes, currently the remediation costs incurred during the environmental cost year are amortized over 5 years, with customers credited with the deferred tax benefit resulting from the amortization. As a result of the sale of the Wilmington gas site, the company will no longer incur remediation costs, so all this left to recover is the current balances. In this filing, the company proposes to consolidate the small remaining balances in the 2019 and 2020 recovery periods, which is about almost $1,200, into the 2018 recovery period, thereby eliminating the need to make the ESR filings in those years. This will save the parties time and expense that customers ultimately pay. The DPA supports this proposal.
Thank you, Ms. Boucher. That completes the public advocate's case. Ms. Boucher is available for cross-examination or for questions by the Commission.
Any of the commissioners have any questions of the parties? Ms. Davis and Ms. Moucher and Mr. Beck, your good work has led to a settlement, and it's in the best interest of the citizens of this state. It's very much appreciated. Thank you for your work. And if we could have a motion on the proposed order.
Motion to approve order number 9143.
Second the motion.
Any discussion on the motion to approve proposed order number 9143? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion carries. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Is there anyone here from the public that wishes to make public comment to the Public Service Commission? The director's comments. Mr. Howard, welcome back from vacation. We missed you on Halloween Day.
We knew you were here, we just weren't sure where.
Chairman Winslow, Commissioners, I'm sorry that I had to be away for a week, but vacation called. And
May I interrupt just for a second? I apologize. Mr. Goodman, while you're still here, Ms. Iori, Mr. Walsh, the one comment I forgot to make was that the speedy discovery situation, whatever it was, I think that the commission sort of looks on with favor, any efficiency and time saving and money saving things that may go on. So it really wasn't of any great consequence, obviously, in the hearing, but I would just like to say that, at least from my personal viewpoint, that anything we can do to make the process more efficient and get the cases done quicker, any innovations that the company wants to put forward are appreciated.
Thank you, Your Honor. Yes, you're referring to the voluntary discovery that we filed before they were asked.
And any other suggestions that DPA might make and the staff might make with respect to, would be obviously positive and well received by the commissioners. Mr. Howard, I'm sorry for the interruption.
Thank you, sir. We have a few things to cover under director's comments today. The first thing we have under director's comments is a staff update on what's been going on at FERC and in the U.S. courts. And Mr. DeLosa is asked for some time to brief the commission on activities there.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. Chairman, commissioners, there are three issues, kind of windy, three issues that I'll be discussing today, two much more briefly than the third. The first is FERC docket EL 05-121. As you'll recall, in January of this year, Mr. Farber brought you into executive session to discuss some of the details of a settlement that the Delaware Public Service Commission has entered into with several other states regarding a large transmission project. The details of that settlement has not changed at this time. We'd just like to update you for your ratification a letter that was sent on your behalf to the FERC requesting of them that they act promptly on this matter due to the restoration of their quorum. The second issue, and I'll take questions after the first two if you have any before I launch into the rulemaking. The next issue is the FERC, DC Circuit Court case on financial transmission rights. There really isn't any particular positions that I'm bringing before you today, just an update. We filed our reply brief in that case before the DC Circuit. As you read in your package, many of those arguments repeat arguments that were made before the Commission, the Federal Commission, and in our opening brief at the DC Circuit. As I'm sure you're familiar, we're not permitted to break any new ground on any arguments at this stage in the proceeding. So I just wanted to update you on the procedural posture of that case and say that staff is trying our best to minimize our lawyers' workload so as to provide efficiency for the ratepayers for any expenses that may occur. So I'll take questions on those two before I dive into the NOPR, if you have any.
Would the commission, you want the commission to approve the letter that was sent?
Yeah, ex post route, no.
I believe we already have authority to have sent that letter, Chairman Winslow. But I appreciate the offer.
Well, it's not necessary. It's not necessary.
Yeah, for these next two documents, Chairman Winslow, they will be before you for ex post ratification of the commission. Now, as you'll remember, on October 17th, I came before you briefing you on the Department of Energy notice of proposed rulemaking to the FERC regarding compensation for eligible resources for fully allocated operating and fuel expenses, cost of capital, and debt, as well as a fair return on equity in that investment. We laid out some positions for you at that time that you approved, giving staff guidance to go forth and comment on your behalf in this docket. I'm pleased to report that the Commission, the DPA, and DENREC, as well as several other parties I'll discuss later, came together to file initial comments and reply comments. Both of those documents were supported by all three of the Delaware agencies, And I think that's a testament to all the parties and how we were able to work together. So I'll start by just kind of summarizing briefly both sets of comments, and then I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you may have. On October 23rd, the date initial comments were due, just the Commission, DPA, and DNREC, just us three, submitted initial comments in this docket that closely followed the direction the Commission gave as a result of my recommendation in October. Specifically, the comments argue that agencies must make rational connections between facts found and choices made. They also must be supported by substantial evidence in the record. Action that fails either requirement is arbitrary and capricious. So what our comments look to do is to show that there is no rational connection between the requirement for 90 days of fuel on site and the urgent, quote unquote, national security, reliability, and resiliency need cited in the NOPR. In support of that, we quoted the National North American Electric Reliability Council's long-term reliability assessment. We cited PJM's March 2017 reliability paper, in which they explained that their expected near-term portfolio is among the highest performing of any portfolio they modeled with respect to 13 separate generator attributes that are needed to reliably operate the system. That white paper also explains that even under extreme contingencies for natural gas supply, portfolios with up to 66% natural gas remained resilient, clearly refuting the DOE NOPR's assertion that there is a reliability or resiliency emergency in the United States electric grid. In support of that argument, we also cited procedures PJM has been developing since the polar vortex to ensure deliverability of their resources throughout the year, among which are capacity performance and the resulting increase in outage rates. And by increase, I mean improvement in outage rates since the polar vortex. Our next point is that any final order resulting from the NOPR would not be just and reasonable in the clearest sense of the term. As a result of the dearth of detail included in the NOPR, there is no way for an agency to consider the potential cost that may be foisted onto ratepayers as a result of this rulemaking. That violates several precedential holdings, including that, as you're familiar, cost must be commensurate with benefits. If you can't analyze cost, you can't determine whether costs and benefits are commensurate. The courts have also held that agencies must consider cost before issuing any regulations. And the staff guidance document that I spoke of last month clearly illustrates that there's not enough detail to even begin an estimation of costs or to be able to find such a proposal just and reasonable. Lastly, we responded to select questions from the staff guidance document in accordance with the guidance the Commission gave. The first question we responded to is, what is resilience? Now, we didn't attempt to take that question head on, but we noted that regional stakeholders should collaborate to determine a definition of resilience suitable to their collective interest. We also noted that there should be a preeminent role for ISO and RTO in the area of cybersecurity. We took the position in the comments that no other entity is sufficiently well suited to be able to address the cybersecurity concerns over such a broad footprint as the ISO RTO. And staff personally would like to commend PJM for efforts that they have been taking in the cybersecurity area, which personally I think are extraordinary. The last point under that question is that it's our view that the Commission should not include provisions for resilience to become a driver in transmission planning. And what I mean by that is there is no reason and has been no justification as yet to substantiate resilience being a standalone driver, as in we're going to build this project specifically for quote-unquote resilience. Now, that comes directly as a result of not having a definition of resilience in the first place. So if you were to make that a driver to build new transmission projects, there's no way you would be able to successfully determine whether that project was needed. We've also taken the position, as Mr. Farber mentioned, that any project built under resilience as a driver, to the extent PJM or the Commission does require that, should be under the state agreement approach, where states would have to agree to any construction for resiliency so that the money spent in those projects does not conflict with the resiliency goals of the state of Delaware and this Commission. The next question we answered is, how is resilience valued? We pointed out that our customers already pay a substantial amount to procure resources above the forecasted peak load of the PJM region. NERC standards require 1 day in 10-year expectation for loss of load, which requires PJM to purchase an amount of capacity above their forecasted peak for the summer. NERC has said that level of reliability provides substantial service even in extreme conditions. So that was our initial comments. I'll stop there to see if the Commission has any questions before I go into the reply comments.
No questions.
All right. Been a long meeting. After we filed the initial comments, staff and the DPA actively participates in what's called the Load Coalition. That's a group of PJM stakeholders with load interests that get together to clarify points of action and how to frame certain issues going on in the PJM stakeholder process. Coming out of those meetings, myself and someone from the Sustainable FERC Project began to draft reply comments. These reply comments specifically respond to the broad-based energy market increase in prices that I referenced last time I was here. That particular point was unfortunately left out of the initial comments just due to the time crunch that we were put under by the timelines in the NOPR. So we were actually able to essentially dedicate a whole document to our concerns of this proposal, or as we call it, a concept, because it's not really fully baked, that PJM is proposing or will propose in the near future. So what PJM did in their initial comments to the NOPR was in direct contravention of what stakeholders asked of them directly before PJM filed. PJM asked the Commission for a compliance directive to file something in response to the NOPR. We call this the pricing concept. So essentially, as I explained last time, PJM would allow the most expensive unit on the system to set the energy price instead of the marginal unit, which can alter its output in response to price. This fails as a general concept since inflexible resources that cannot change their load in response to price can never be marginal. These reply comments were essentially split into two parts, process concerns and substance concerns. Among the process concerns, PJM has publicly represented that they plan to file this in a 3-month time frame under Section 206 of the Federal Power Act. Such a filing would not require stakeholder review or vetting of such a program. A FERC compliance directive would similarly allow PJM to avoid stakeholder scrutiny by responding to a compliance directive, essentially with a compliance filing. So there would be no need for a stakeholder vote or approval of anything that PJM is developing before they would submit it on compliance to the FERC. The second thing that we noted is that the Commission acting on this issue as a result of the NOPR would be procedurally improper, since energy market price formation reforms in a market-based construct were not at all the subject of the DOE NOPR, but instead that was a cost of service-based payment outside of the Commission's regulatory construct, and as a result, the Commission cannot bootstrap notice from an unrelated notice of proposed rulemaking. There's also no record evidence for the Commission to act on PJM's request with any urgency. As PJM itself points out throughout their comments, there's no emergency in PJM. That's what we pointed out in our initial comments. That's what the overwhelmingly vast majority of industry commenters told the FERC in response to this NOPR. They said there's no emergency. The markets at this point are working great. PJM has provided empirical analysis to demonstrate this relative to actual reliability attributes needed to operate the system. There's just no urgency. Further to support that, units that are currently retiring are not young or efficient. The average age of units that retired in the last 4 years is 54 years for coal plants. Units at risk of coal units at risk of retirement are 49 years old. Additionally, PJM has almost 212,000 megawatts on the system, while their forecast pool requirement plus peak load, which is the total amount they need to buy to get to that 1 day and 10-year standard I was talking about earlier, is about 165,000 megawatts. So as you're familiar, as is clear, there is a fair amount of excess capacity in PJM. Now, one of the main reasons PJM has asked for this, and it's not just PJM. PJM, Exelon, PSE&G, and First Energy all ask for a variant of this proposal. One of the main justifications for the proposal is, quote-unquote, flattening supply curves, essentially without any further justification. PJM itself concedes that to the extent these flattening supply curves were the result of economic fundamentals, there would be no problem to be solved. And it seems to me like it's a fairly simple economic problem that when you have a fairly substantial amount of oversupply, the competition in the area of the supply curve where supply is expected to meet demand will become ultra competitive and accordingly drive down prices. This is one of the chief benefits that the FERC has cited in the justness and reasonableness of its markets, is sending competitive entry and exit signals to resources. There are also many, many details and issues to be resolved in the pricing concept. There really are no foundational details about how this would apply, who would get paid, how much, what's the price setting logic. As a result, there's no way that PJM should be able to file something in a near-term deadline and avoid stakeholder consideration while doing so. Lastly, in the process section, but certainly not least, is that if the Commission were to issue a compliance directive on this, they would have to find LMP unjust and unreasonable before they could issue a compliance directive. LMP pricing logic is used in every ISO and RTO around the country. Now, while that doesn't specifically affect Delaware as much as the pricing concept, such a finding could similarly throw the wholesale markets across the country into chaos, as all of them use LMP pricing. In order to provide a directive for energy market pricing, the Commission would first have to make a finding that the existing rules, LMP, are unjust and unreasonable. That would be a monumental finding that would have to be supported with incredibly substantial evidence, and that showing has not been made. Now, essentially, I'll kind of
excuse my interruption. Question.
Yes.
So, has any of the parties communicated that to the FERC?
Yes. So PJM did not specifically ask for a finding that its LMP was unjust and unreasonable. Exelon did, as well as PSE&G. Okay. They both. It's interesting, Commissioner Gray. It was kind of a tangential ask, something that they knew the Commission would have to find before going with their preferred solution, but not necessarily something that they sought to support with the level of support that would be needed for such a landmark finding. Thank you. As far as substance, I'm just going to kind of hit the high points. If you'd like me to go into any more detail, some of it gets a little gory. It's all laid out in black and white in the documents that were forwarded to you. Gina provided, I think, a great way to put it very bluntly when she was so kind to edit the reply document. She said, generators would be paid more for providing exactly what they're providing today. There's simply no justification that can withstand such an increase in payment with no commensurate responsibilities. Among the attempted justifications that fail are the basis that it would reduce quote-unquote uplift out of market payments. Our comments substantially show, as bolstered by an analysis from consultants on the load side and also on the generation side, that it would not reduce uplift. PJM further seeks to justify its pricing concept on the basis that it would incent flexibility, when in fact the pricing concept and associated out-of-market payments would just replace the incentives already inherent in the LMP construct, again at a substantially inflated price. And lastly, PJM seeks to justify its pricing concept on the basis that other RTOs and ISOs have made further quote-unquote progress in pricing. That is notwithstanding substantial evidence to the contrary, most notably that while New York ISO does allow inflexible fast start units only to set the price, and in fact they were the first ISO to do so in 2001, when the Commission opened a rulemaking on this topic last year, the New York ISO specifically asked the FERC, with 10 years of experience in this matter, to not extend the set of inflexible units that could set price beyond this very narrow group of fast start resources, which would be essentially totally the opposite of what PJM is proposing in their pricing concept. So, as the Commission further directed, we offered a potential path forward, noting that identifying specific needs and operating the grid, developing metrics to support those needs, and valuing these attributes appropriately and narrowly through competition is the right path forward. The next steps we can expect is that we likely see FERC action by November 22nd. The Secretary of Energy has laid out an extremely abbreviated timeline for FERC action. However, the DOE Act also provides that FERC can essentially do whatever it pleases with the DOE NOPR. Anything from accept it outright to reject it outright to use it as the basis for any number of FERC proceedings. So we really have no idea where it's going to go from here. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions that the Commission may have.
I have one last question, please. Thank you for that overview. Do the fast start resources, the ones that you mentioned, maybe should be the subset and the targeted group, include nuclear generators?
They do not. So the units, the inflexible units eligible to set price in several RTOs are only resources that can start up within 30 minutes and have minimum run times of an hour or less. So the essential, real fast, the essential reasoning for that is that despite the fact that it's an inflexible resource, it's block loaded so it's on or off. But because it can be on and off so fast, essentially that whole unit is marginal. Because even though all the cost of that unit would go in to set the price, because it's on and off, it is extremely responsive to price and therefore could be eligible to be marginal. The Commission or staff has not taken a position on that specific issue at this time.
When he said one last question, I thought John Farber was back.
We miss him, Chairman.
Well, Chairman.
I just want to express my thanks to Joe. These comments were excellent. I mean, editing them was easy. And I actually learned so much from reading them. But he spent a lot of time on it, and it really shows. He did an excellent job, and I just wanted to I told him that in emails, but I wanted to get it out in the public.
Thank you, Ms. Ivory. I think the Commission is equally impressed with the work. Thank you, Joe. Wonderful job, and we appreciate it. And we want to do a vote here to
please
approve what was filed correctly.
Please, ex post ratification of each of those two documents, Chairman.
Can we have a motion?
I move that the Commission adopt the
ex post ratification of the initial and reply comments.
Second the motion.
Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion carries. Thank you.
Chairman, Commissioner.
Howard, sir.
Chairman Winslow, I do want to express, I do miss Mr. Farber. In fact, there's some question about the missing coffee pot in our office and where it went when he retired. But we'll work through that. But it's fairly obvious that Mr. DeLosa is picked up and is moving right along in full speed. So I think we're very lucky to have Mr. DeLosa to delve into the details associated with this.
How does a phone drive, ride a bicycle, and carry a Keurig at the same time?
Chairman Winslow, we often get some of these emails from you and other commissioners that say, you know, there's this nice WebEx out there that we really should have staff take a look at. And Matt and I have been in receipt of some of those, and because we're kind of short on staff for some of this work right now, Matt and I have had the opportunity to participate in some webinars that we probably haven't had a chance to do in the past. And so we would like to share with you, despite the late hour of the day, and despite the fact that people are bailing out, we would like to share with you some of the information we've obtained in those webinars. And I would ask Mr. Hartigan if he would share his information on the NRRI webinar.
Thank you, Mr. Howard.
It's going to take, because I may bail too.
Shouldn't be more than 2 hours. Commissioner, at your request, I did attend a NRRI seminar yesterday regarding the economics of storm hardening. It was led by Dr. Ted Curry from the University of Florida. In Florida in 2004 and 2005, they had 10 named storms, which caused billions of dollars in damage. After that, the Florida PSC convened a workshop and ultimately issued an order that requires utilities there to file an annual storm preparedness plan, which includes vegetation management program, a 6-year transmission structure inspection program, post-storm data collection and forensic analysis, and also analysis around differentiating the benefits of overhead versus underground systems. Dr. Curry stressed the importance of being proactive in this, and that Florida has had these meetings every year, even though there hasn't been major storms every year, but they're beneficial to discuss plans and lessons learned and best practices, that kind of thing. Dr. Curry did say, in addition to the workshop, other initiatives include the use of a model to simulate cost-benefit analysis. Coincidentally, Dr. Curry has a model, if we're interested. And also a separate vegetation management workshop to share best practices and discuss barriers. There was a lot of discussion about how there's barriers between a utility's territory and a municipal territory, for example. So workshops can help clear some of those misunderstandings. Other jurisdictions, including D.C. and North Carolina, have done investigations regarding undergrounding all their utilities after storms. They found that the costs are extremely prohibitive, as you would imagine, and in most cases would end up doubling a residential utility bill on a monthly basis. So probably not an option. So the seminar boiled down to states identifying what is our risk tolerance in terms of undergrounding and storm hardening. What damage are we trying to mitigate? Is it high winds? Is it flooding, storm surge? And then how much are we willing to pay to make that happen? Dr. Curry concluded that a collaborative stakeholder approach is the best way to do that, as opposed to individual utilities trying to figure it out. Regulatory leadership is required to make that happen. And that cost effectiveness really depends on several different factors. There's really no way you can harden a system to prevent any damage. So you really have to be strategic about your risk tolerance and cost tolerance. In Delaware, there are some efforts underway. You may not be aware, but legislatively, DENREC and DEMA, the Delaware Emergency Management Agency, are responsible for storm preparedness and our response to storms. the Delaware PSC has a seat at that table and participates in exercises every year. And I think, Delmarva does a very good job in terms of notifying us for storms approaching and their response to them. But there may be an opportunity to dig a little bit deeper and get more detail about their storm preparedness and then what analysis they do afterwards to see how the recovery went in terms of costs and lessons learned, that kind of thing. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Did you find it beneficial?
I did. It was very informative.
Good.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Matt. I, on the other hand, had a separate webinar about the same time that Matt was doing that. My seminar was entitled Ripening Market for Prepay Energy in North America. And it was provided to us by DFGC. In case you don't know what acronyms stand for, DFGC is the Distributed Energy Financial Group, LLC. It's a management consulting firm that talks a lot about prepay. They've been around for about 8 years. Jamie Wimberly, who was making the contact and was making the presentation, he indicated that the firm actually also had a prepay energy working group. They refer to that as PEWG. So in case there's an interest in that, there's a working group that this consulting firm sponsors. Jamie considers prepay as the latest mega trend in consumer finance. You're all aware of the gift cards and the cards that you can get at Wawa and every place else. I mean, it's just a matter, you want to put money on the card, you put money on the card. You want to spend the money, you spend the money. It's the latest deal. And they basically say that the prepay for electric utilities is just another mechanism and an extension of that concept. Needless to say, DEFG is quite bullish on the prepay program, okay, because that's their thing. The webinar discussed it strictly as a voluntary program. There probably are other programs where maybe they mandate certain people, but this was strictly talking about it voluntary. And according to DEFG, the principal drivers for this program are customer convenience and customer control, be able to turn their energy on and off as they will. One of the interesting things I found out is that customer energy consumption drops, usually 7 to 12% for the customers who use this program. DEFG thinks this benefit is due to improved communications from the utilities and the customer's awareness about energy use. However, other participants noted it was more likely from forced deprivation and lack of funds in order to continue to have their energy at their house. I think the other participants certainly hit a major issue right there. According to DEFG, 12 utilities, including Pepco Holdings, are planning prepay pilots. There are 6 pilot programs currently going on. 12 utilities are engaged in full-scale efforts. And out of 15 companies that were reporting to them, which is mostly cooperatives and municipals, 243,000 customers are enrolled in prepay programs. So that's kind of their status that they're aware of. It was also interesting to note the webinar cited Delaware as one of 4 states with active proceedings. But unless I've missed it, Delmarva has not yet filed that proceeding.
They haven't filed yet, but
It's coming, yeah. But it was interesting that they thought it was an active filing in Delaware already.
well, maybe just talking about it is the definition of active for them.
Well, they also proposed in their last ranking.
Yeah. One of the things that I thought was interesting is the 9 policy areas that they recommended for consideration, and they're all the same things we've talked about on prepay programs. Keeping the program strictly voluntary, how do you protect service during extreme weather conditions, what do you do for the vulnerable population out there that are handicapped or have other issues, do you have to knock on the door before you turn their power off, or can you just turn their power off by virtue of saying you didn't pay anything, so your power's off? What kind of account notification alerts do you want to send out? How do you manage arrearages within the program? How do you handle the cost of service, such as transactional fees for the payment channels? What are the payment channels you're going to use? And then, obviously, dealing with synergies with existing low-income payment facilities, such as Catholic Charities or LIHEAP or whatever. Finally, I guess, long last, based on their customer surveys, 75% of the program participants are satisfied. However, some of the other participants on the call pointed out that they had no other options. It was either that or pay a security deposit, and if you couldn't afford the security deposit, this was the only option you had. So some of the other participants said, it would be nice to have other options for low-income customers, and to figure out what that level of satisfaction was when there's other options available. So that was another interesting finding from that discussion.
Was this prepaid just for low income?
No, it was not.
Okay, I was gonna say, because when you said that one of the policy issues was arrearages, well, how do you have arrearages when you're prepaid?
Yeah.
Well, but it's how do you handle the arrearage, and what level of arrearage do you accept and let people in the program with? Because people in the program, according to them, people in the program do tend to pay down their arrearages over time. So
we're in the PEWG. I mean, we're probably not as active in it as we could be, but we've been getting their stuff and kind of following along with them.
It'd be interesting also to know what happens to the tenant who prepays the landlord who takes the money and doesn't pay the utility.
Item number 10 on my list of issues.
15 years ago, Bill O'Brien sat in your office and discussed this very same thing.
My office.
No.
Kevin.
Oh.
Texas has been doing this for, I don't know, a decade.
Yeah.
Actually, it's pretty popular
I
in
mean,
Europe.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's even more popular in Europe, yeah.
So, I think sometime we'll probably get around to it.
Well, sometime I'm pretty sure you'll get around to it.
Sooner rather than
It's
later.
coming.
That's good, because I know that Commissioner Conaway and I both had sort of wondered when it might be arriving. I think for low-income people, it appears to be a good tool for them to manage their money and their energy use.
But you'll be able to turn the power off down at your southern residence when you don't want to use it in the wintertime. So.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, right.
A few last things. Mr. Goodman was probably hanging around for a little while, but he probably had to head down to Bethany Beach because there's an energy efficiency public comment session down there tonight at the Bethany Beach Town Hall on Garfield Parkway. And so I know Ms. Knotts is heading down there as well. So we will have the final, I think that's the final public comment session for the energy efficiency program that Delmarva filed. Just to let you know, with any kind of luck, we might have a new video streaming system on the November 30th meeting, maybe. One that doesn't shut down in the middle of everything and fail us. So maybe we'll get there. Commissioner Conway made note earlier to me that this is National Scrapple Day, and I didn't want to miss the opportunity to brief you on that.
I was going to say, can you cook us up a mess of Scrabble? I love Scrabble.
Mr. Howard turned me on to this National Blank Day. And today it came up National Scrapple Day.
November 30th is our next commission meeting, and I wish everybody a happy Veterans Day holiday tomorrow. Please don't come to work.
And a happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you, everyone.
Oh, that's right.
We're adjourned.
There's your round to it.
More round to it?
When you got a round